In the dim light of a quiet, forgotten corner of a distant museum, an ancient relic lay hidden. It was a small, unassuming pendant, its surface etched with cryptic symbols, worn smooth by the passing of centuries. A relic that had once been a proud family heirloom, passed down through generations, now rusting into the shadow of obscurity. Yet, to those who knew its true nature, the pendant was more than just an artifact. It was a key to a mystery that had haunted a family for centuries. The story of a curse that traveled from continent to continent, leaving destruction and despair in its wake. A curse that had been inherited by each generation, its dark legacy perpetuated by the sins of the past. And it was this relic, this symbol of a forgotten family's history, that would eventually lead one of its descendants to uncover the terrifying truth. The family had once been grand. In their prime, they had been known for their wealth, power, and influence. They had built empires, controlled vast estates, and rubbed shoulders with the greatest minds and most powerful figures of their time. Their name was synonymous with success, respect, and opulence. But what few knew, what no one dared speak of, was that beneath the surface of this family's carefully curated image, there was a dark secret. A secret that would change everything for them. It began with a man named Elias Vandenberg, the patriarch of the family, a man whose ambition knew no bounds. Elias had always been a man driven by a need for power, a thirst for control that bordered on obsession. He believed that through wealth and influence he could bend the world to his will. His reputation for ruthless business practices was well known, but it was his obsession with a mysterious family heirloom, a pendant that had been passed down through generations, that would eventually seal his fate. The pendant was rumored to be cursed, an ancient relic tied to a forgotten history, a family secret that had been buried for centuries. Despite the warnings, Elias was undeterred. He believed the pendant held the key to unlocking unimaginable power, a power that would ensure his place in history. When Elias first acquired the pendant, it was said that he had felt a strange sensation, a chill that ran down his spine the moment he touched it. Some claimed that they saw his eyes change, his once warm and kind demeanor replaced by a cold, calculating expression. Yet, Elias dismissed these concerns, dismissing the superstition surrounding the relic as nothing more than folklore. But as time passed, strange things began to happen. People close to Elias started to die in mysterious, unexplained circumstances. Business partners vanished without a trace. Family members were struck down by illnesses that defied all medical explanation. And with each death, the family's wealth and influence seemed to grow, as if the curse was feeding off the lives of those it claimed. Whispers began to circulate, stories of a curse that had been placed on the family long ago, a curse that could not be broken. It was said that the curse had been triggered when Elias had stolen the pendant from its rightful owner, an ancestor who had been a renowned sorcerer. The sorcerer's bloodline had been dedicated to guarding the relic, ensuring it never fell into the wrong hands. But Elias had been too eager to claim its power. And so, the curse was set into motion, a curse that would follow his bloodline across the world, claiming victim after victim, leaving destruction in its wake. For decades, the Vandenberg family tried to escape the curse. Elias himself moved from country to country, taking the pendant with him as he searched for a way to break its hold. But the curse would not be denied. It followed him to the United States, where he tried to establish a new life. It followed him to South America, where his family found fleeting success in the mining industry. It followed him to Europe, where he became entangled in a political scandal that destroyed his reputation. Everywhere the family went, the curse followed, leaving a trail of tragedy in its wake. But perhaps the most tragic consequence of Elias's greed was the death of his only son, Samuel Vandenberg. Samuel, like his father, had been a driven man, obsessed with reclaiming the family's lost glory. But he had been unaware of the curse's true power, or the toll it had taken on the family's future. Samuel's death was brutal, a violent and inexplicable tragedy that sent shockwaves through the family. It was as though the curse had reached its peak, claiming one last life before its wrath subsided. Or so they thought. Years later, in the early 20th century, the Vandenberg family would see another victim fall to the curse, this time in the form of Eleanor Vandenberg, Elias's great-granddaughter. Eleanor had been a woman of great intellect and ambition, known for her groundbreaking work as a historian and archaeologist. She had spent much of her life searching for the truth behind the curse, attempting to uncover its origins. But her obsession with the family's dark past led her down a dangerous path. In her pursuit of knowledge, Eleanor had uncovered the final piece of the puzzle, a hidden journal written by her great-grandfather Elias, detailing the full extent of the curse and its origins. The journal spoke of a forgotten pact made with a dark entity, a pact that would ensure the family's power in exchange for the souls of its descendants. Eleanor's obsession with the journal would ultimately be her downfall. She became consumed by the need to understand the curse, to uncover the truth about the entity that had bound her family to its will. But in doing so, she sealed her own fate. Her death, like those before her, was violent and unexplained, her body discovered in a remote corner of the family estate, her eyes wide with terror, as though she had seen something unimaginable. The curse, it seemed, had no end. As the years passed, the Vandenberg family continued to crumble under its weight. Some members disappeared without a trace, their fates never to be known. Others lived in fear, constantly on edge, terrified of what might happen next. Yet one thing remained constant: the pendant. No matter how far the family tried to run, no matter how many generations passed, the pendant remained with them, a silent reminder of the curse that had followed them across the globe. In the present day, the last known descendant of the Vandenberg family, a young woman named Clara, begins to uncover the truth about her family's dark past. Clara, who had grown up hearing the hushed whispers and half-remembered stories about the Vandenberg curse, never fully believed in it. She had lived her life free from the shadows that had haunted her ancestors, or so she thought. But as strange events begin to unfold around her, she begins to wonder if there is more to the curse than she had ever imagined. Clara's investigation into the family's past leads her down a dark and dangerous path, one that takes her across 3 continents, retracing the steps of her ancestors and uncovering the dark history that has been hidden for so long. Along the way, she encounters other descendants of the Vandenberg family, each of whom carries their own scars, their own tales of tragedy and loss. And as she gets closer to the truth, Clara begins to realize that the curse is not just a myth, not just a superstition. It is real, and it is waiting for her. The pendant, once thought to be nothing more than a symbol of the family's wealth and power, now takes on a new significance. Clara learns that the pendant is not just a family heirloom, it is a key that can unlock the secret of the curse, a curse that has claimed the lives of her ancestors and continues to haunt her family to this day. But as she delves deeper into the mystery, Clara begins to wonder, is she truly the last hope for breaking the curse? Or will she, too, become another victim in the long line of the Vandenberg family's tragic history? And so, the cycle begins again. The curse, once thought to be forgotten, is reborn. And Clara's journey has only just begun. The Vandenberg family had never been ordinary. Their origins were shrouded in mystery, with no clear account of how their name first emerged or when they began to rise to prominence. What was known, however, was that their wealth and influence seemed to appear overnight, and with it, an unsettling presence. The family's estate, a sprawling mansion tucked away in the hills of northern Europe, became a symbol of their success. The architecture was grand, a blend of Gothic and classical design, with towering spires that seemed to scrape the heavens. It was a place that inspired awe, yet also unease in those who visited. The mansion's long corridors echoed with the sounds of history, but there was a heaviness to those echoes, an energy that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Elias Vandenberg, the patriarch of this legacy, had inherited the estate at a young age after the sudden and unexplained death of his father. It was said that Elias's father had been a man of great ambition, much like his son, and had built the family's fortune from nothing. The Vandenbergs were not always so wealthy. Their rise was marked by shrewd business deals, hidden alliances, and even darker dealings. But there was something else, something no one spoke of openly, that set the Vandenbergs apart from their peers. The family's fortune had been established upon something more than mere luck or cunning. In the early days of Elias's inheritance, the family was known for its charitable works. They gave generously to the arts, funded schools, and were patrons of various scientific endeavors. Their name carried weight in political circles, and their influence spread far. But this generosity, this image of benevolence, masked a growing obsession. Elias, like his father before him, had a thirst for knowledge, but unlike his father, Elias's hunger for knowledge wasn't just intellectual, it was spiritual, occult even. It was at this point that the story of the pendant first entered the family's history. Elias had heard whispers about the pendant long before he ever laid eyes on it. It was said to be an ancient relic, passed down through generations, its origins lost to time. Some claimed it had belonged to a great sorcerer, a man who had once wielded unimaginable power, and that the pendant held the key to unlocking the true potential of the human spirit. Others said it was cursed, bound with dark magic that could bring both great power and great destruction. But to Elias, it was nothing more than a myth, until the day he found it. The pendant had been tucked away in a forgotten chest in the family estate's library, hidden among dusty tomes and faded letters. When Elias first discovered it, he was drawn to it immediately, as though some unseen force had guided him to it. The moment his fingers brushed against its cold surface, something inside him changed. It was as if a switch had been flipped. He felt a surge of energy, an awakening deep within, as if the pendant had unlocked something buried within him, a potential he had never known existed. And with that awakening came a realization. The family's legacy, their wealth, their power, all of it had been built on a secret that the pendant held. But what Elias didn't know, what no one had prepared him for, was that the pendant came with a price that would be paid in blood. At first, the changes were subtle. Elias became more driven, more focused on his business ventures. The family's wealth grew exponentially, and the Vandenbergs became even more influential. But with each passing year, the darkness began to creep in. His relationships with his family members became strained, his temper flared, and a coldness began to take over him. His once vibrant and loving nature was replaced by a calculating, ruthless persona. It was as if the pendant was changing him, transforming him into someone he no longer recognized. The first death came quietly. His younger brother, Samuel, had been a jovial and compassionate man, the polar opposite of Elias. Samuel had always been a stabilizing force in the family, someone who kept Elias grounded. But one night, Samuel was found dead in his study, his body cold and lifeless. The cause of death was never determined. No signs of struggle, no visible wounds. It was as if the life had simply drained from him. The family was devastated by the loss, but Elias seemed unfazed. He mourned his brother's passing, of course, but there was something unsettling about the way he reacted. He didn't seem to feel the same grief as the others. He seemed almost relieved, as if his brother's death had somehow removed an obstacle from his path. The family wrote it off as a freak accident, but there were whispers. Whispers that Elias's increasing obsession with the pendant had something to do with it. But no one dared voice these suspicions aloud, not to Elias's face. Years passed, and the curse, if it could be called that, began to reveal itself in other ways. Business partners who disagreed with Elias found themselves ruined, their businesses failing under mysterious circumstances. Rivals who sought to challenge the Vandenbergs' dominance in the political and financial world vanished, their fates unclear. It was as if the world was conspiring to clear the path for Elias and his family, but at a cost. And then came the day that the family's once great mansion was struck by fire. It was the worst tragedy the Vandenbergs had ever faced. The fire raged for hours, consuming the estate and everything within it. When the smoke finally cleared, the mansion lay in ruins, a smoldering shell of what it had once been. No one knew how the fire started. Some claimed it was an accident, others believed it was an act of sabotage. But there was no definitive answer. And amidst the ashes, Elias stood, unscathed, his eyes hollow as if the fire had burned away something deep within him. He stood over the ruins of his legacy, but there was no sorrow in his gaze. Only coldness. From that moment on, the Vandenbergs were no longer the respected family they had once been. The fire had shattered their public image and their wealth began to dwindle. It was as though the curse, the very thing that had granted them everything, was now stripping it all away. The family moved to America, trying to rebuild their fortunes, but the shadow of the curse loomed over them. Each new venture ended in failure. Business deals fell through. Investments turned sour. The family's name became synonymous with misfortune, and those who had once adored them now spoke in hushed tones about the fall of the Vandenbergs. But Elias was undeterred. He knew the pendant still held power. He knew the curse was not finished with them yet. And so, he took it with him, carrying it wherever he went, hoping that it would guide him to the success he so desperately sought. But with each passing year, the toll grew greater. The curse continued to take its victims, slowly but surely. Relatives died in strange accidents. Friends betrayed them. The weight of their family history became too much to bear. And Elias, the once proud patriarch, began to see the truth. The curse wasn't just a force that followed them from place to place. It was a part of them, embedded in their very bloodline. The Vandenbergs were cursed, and there was no escape. The family had unknowingly bound themselves to something far darker than they could ever have imagined, and now they were paying the price. The question was not how to break the curse, it was whether they could survive it at all. And as the years wore on, as the legacy of Elias's ambition and greed unfolded, one thing became clear: the curse would follow them wherever they went. It was only a matter of time before it would claim them all. It was a bitter winter day when tragedy struck for the first time, in a way that no one could have ever predicted. Samuel Vandenberg, Elias's younger brother, had always been the one who balanced the darkness that was slowly consuming their family. Where Elias was consumed by ambition, ruthlessness, and an insatiable desire for power, Samuel was the heart of the Vandenbergs, the one who believed in integrity, fairness, and love. While Elias quietly reveled in the shadowy growth of their wealth and influence, Samuel spoke of redemption, of restoring the family name to its rightful place among the righteous. He was the last remaining force that seemed to tether the family to any semblance of goodness, but it was this very purity that would lead him straight into the path of the curse. Samuel had always felt uneasy about the strange occurrences that seemed to follow his brother's rise to prominence. Whispers of the Vandenberg curse had been circulating for years, but Samuel had dismissed them as superstitions, relics of a bygone era that had no place in the modern world. But as he witnessed the gradual decay of Elias's character, the growing coldness in his eyes, the ruthless decisions, and the ever-present obsession with the pendant, something began to change in Samuel. The unease he had once pushed aside grew into a tangible fear, one that gnawed at his conscience. He had always trusted Elias, but now he felt a growing distance between them, a chasm that neither love nor family ties could bridge. The night of Samuel's death began like any other. He had returned to the family estate after a long day in the city, his face drawn with fatigue but determined to find some peace. He had planned to sit by the fire and write a letter to his wife, perhaps even visit the nearby village to clear his mind. But when he arrived at the mansion, something was wrong. The house was eerily silent, as though it had been emptied of life. He called out, but no answer came. The servants were nowhere to be found, and Elias's study, which Samuel knew well, was locked from the inside. Samuel, always the more inquisitive of the two, had become suspicious. He had overheard Elias speaking to someone late that evening, but when he tried to approach, he had been met with silence. His brother's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and tonight, it seemed as if Elias had locked himself away in his study, consumed by whatever darkness he was harboring. Samuel, unwilling to let the mystery go, had decided to confront Elias. He approached the study, his heart pounding with an unease that had only grown stronger over the years. As Samuel reached for the door handle, he noticed something strange. A faint odor of burning, something metallic, almost sickly sweet, lingered in the air. He hesitated for a moment, but then the door swung open of its own accord. What he found inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. Elias was standing by the window, his back to Samuel, staring out into the night. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were different. There was an emptiness in them, a coldness that sent a shiver down Samuel's spine. The pendant, which had been locked away in a drawer, now hung around Elias's neck, gleaming with an unnatural glow. The air in the room felt thick, charged with something malevolent. "Elias." Samuel's voice trembled. "What is happening here? What are you doing?" Elias didn't respond at first, and Samuel took a step closer. He noticed the pages of an old, weathered journal scattered across the desk. The journal that had once belonged to their great-grandfather, the one filled with cryptic symbols and writings that spoke of an ancient curse. The journal that Elias had become obsessed with in recent years. It seemed as if Elias had been consumed by whatever madness lay within its pages. But it was the next sight that froze Samuel's blood. On the desk, hidden beneath the journal, was a dark stain. A stain that at first looked like ink, but upon closer inspection, was unmistakably blood. The realization hit Samuel like a physical blow. The death of their father had not been an accident. And now, Samuel could feel the truth settling heavily in his chest. Elias had been behind their father's death. But what did this all mean? Elias slowly turned to face his brother, his mouth curling into a cold, almost empty smile. "I did it for us, Samuel," he whispered. "For the family. The curse won't stop until we do what's necessary." Samuel's blood ran cold as he tried to comprehend his brother's words. The pendant, the curse, it was all real. And Elias had willingly embraced it. The darkness that had been lingering on the edge of their lives had now taken root within Elias himself. Samuel had no words left. He had no way of stopping this madness. But as he stood there, frozen, his brother's smile widened. He could feel the tension in the air, the growing sense of doom. Samuel realized too late that he had made a grave mistake in confronting Elias. His mind raced, trying to find an escape, but his body was paralyzed with fear. Before he could act, Elias stepped forward, the pendant glowing brighter than ever, its ominous energy filling the room. "Do you understand now?" Elias's voice was low and dangerous, the words laced with a strange power. It's too late to stop it. The curse is not something we can escape. It's a part of us. It always has been. With those words, the room seemed to close in around Samuel. The walls felt as though they were shifting, bending, as if the house itself was alive with the curse's influence. The temperature dropped, and Samuel could see his breath form in the air. His heart raced, and every instinct screamed at him to flee, but his legs refused to move. Elias's face began to distort, his eyes growing darker, deeper. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. Samuel collapsed to the floor, his body crumpling in an unnatural way, his eyes staring vacantly at the ceiling, his life extinguished in an instant. No one would ever know the full truth of what had happened that night. Samuel's body was discovered the next morning, his death officially labeled as a heart attack, though there were no signs to explain it. The family grieved, but Elias remained unscathed, his role in the tragedy unspoken. The Vandenbergs, now in the aftermath of their patriarch's death, were left to pick up the pieces. But the curse had already claimed another victim, and it seemed that the darkness Elias had unleashed was only growing stronger. The strange events that followed Samuel's death became harder to ignore. Elias's behavior became even more erratic. He withdrew from family matters, no longer concerned with appearances or maintaining the family's reputation. He became more secretive, more withdrawn. And with every passing day, the family felt the curse tightening its grip, as if it had chosen Elias as its vessel. But it was Samuel's death, the first truly tragic loss, that marked the beginning of a descent into madness that would stretch far beyond the family estate. It was the moment that Elias's actions set in motion a series of events that no one could have foreseen. Each decision, each step forward, would lead them deeper into the heart of darkness as the curse, and its legacy, continued to haunt them all. As the years passed, Elias Vandenberg tried to convince himself that the curse could be outrun, that perhaps the tragic events of the past could be left behind. Yet, deep within him there was an insistent pull, a reminder that no matter how far they went, no matter how many new lands they sought to claim, the curse would follow them. It had become a part of them, an inescapable shadow that lingered over every decision, every attempt to start anew. And so, when Elias moved his family from the desolate estate in Europe to the bustling streets of New York City, he told himself that this time would be different. This time they would escape the grip of the curse. But deep down he knew better. The curse was never far behind. New York, with its towering skyscrapers and promises of prosperity, seemed like the perfect place to rebuild. It was a city of reinvention, a place where anyone could start fresh. Elias had arrived with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to make his mark once again. The Vandenbergs were wealthy, well-connected, and could afford the finest things. They rented a grand townhouse on the Upper East Side, a place that spoke of their old-world refinement, but with the modern flair of New York's elite. For a time, it seemed as though the Vandenbergs were truly escaping the past, until the whispers began again. At first it was just rumors. A strange accident here, a mysterious death there. Unexplained tragedies seemed to follow the Vandenbergs wherever they went. But Elias, ever the pragmatist, dismissed them. He couldn't afford to be distracted by superstition. He had a family to care for, a fortune to rebuild. Yet, despite his best efforts, there was always a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. His brother Samuel's death, though officially ruled a natural cause, had always haunted him, and he couldn't shake the image of his brother's cold, lifeless body in that study. He had hoped that by moving far from the family estate, he could bury the past, but as the months passed, Elias realized that the curse was more insidious than he could have ever imagined. It had followed them across the ocean, creeping into the seams of their new life, just as it had in Europe. It was as if it had found a way to adapt, to exist even in the most modern of settings. The pendant, which Elias had kept hidden away in a locked drawer, had never stopped calling to him. He began to sense its pull, to feel its weight on his soul, and though he told himself it was just the stress of the move, the truth was undeniable. The curse was still there. Then came the day that would change everything. A week before Christmas, the Vandenbergs received a telegram from an old acquaintance, an associate of Elias's father, inviting them to a gathering in the city's exclusive social circles. This was a chance for Elias to network, to find new allies who could help him regain his position. It was a chance to finally turn the tide. But as he prepared to attend, a strange sense of foreboding settled in his chest. He had seen the same signs before, the same patterns that had marked the events leading up to his brother's death. His wife Margaret had noticed it too. The light in his eyes was fading again, his demeanor growing darker. "Elias, please," she had begged, her voice trembling with concern. "You can't keep running from this. You can't keep pretending that everything is fine. We've lost too much already. But Elias, ever the stubborn one, refused to listen. He couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. Not when they were on the verge of reclaiming everything they had lost. He needed this. He needed to believe that there was a future where the curse didn't control them. So, despite Margaret's protests, he went to the gathering. The evening unfolded like any other high society event. The room was filled with influential men and women, their laughter and conversation echoing through the marble halls of the grand mansion. The Vandenbergs were greeted with polite smiles and handshakes, the usual pleasantries exchanged. But as the night wore on, something felt off. Elias found himself surrounded by strangers, faces that seemed oddly familiar, as though he had seen them in a different lifetime. Among the crowd was a woman, standing apart from the others. She was tall and striking, her eyes dark and penetrating as though she could see straight through him. She was dressed in deep, dark colors, her expression unreadable. There was something about her that unsettled Elias, something that felt wrong. Yet, when she approached him, there was a strange familiarity in her voice. "Elias Vandenberg," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "It's been a long time." Elias froze. He had never seen this woman before in his life, yet her words struck him like a bolt of lightning. He could feel his pulse quicken, his breath shallow. Her gaze bore into him, and for a moment, it was as if the entire room faded into the background. "Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice hoarse. She smiled, a knowing smile, one that sent chills down his spine. "Oh, you don't recognize me, do you?" She took a step closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "I know you, Elias. I know your family. I know everything about you. The pendant, the curse, the deaths." Elias took a step back, his mind racing. The pendant, the curse. Had it followed him here? Had it found a way to reach him even in this foreign place? He glanced around the room as if expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the shadows. But the guests around him continued to drink and laugh, unaware of the conversation taking place just inches away. "I don't know what you're talking about," Elias said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain calm. The woman's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with an almost predatory intensity. "You can't escape it, Elias. It's already here. You've already made your choices. Now it's time to face the consequences." Her words were a poison in his mind, and Elias could feel the walls closing in around him. He had tried to outrun the curse. He had tried to bury it, to start anew, but now, standing in front of this woman, he realized with a sickening certainty that the curse had always been with him. It wasn't just the pendant. It wasn't just his actions. It was something deeper, something far more sinister. Before he could respond, the woman turned and vanished into the crowd, leaving Elias standing in stunned silence. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. He knew she was right. The curse had followed them to America, just as it had followed them across the ocean. It was never going to let them go. That night, Elias returned home, his mind in turmoil. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. He told Margaret nothing about the woman, but she could see the change in him. He was no longer the man he had been before. His eyes were hollow, his steps heavy, as though the burden of the past was finally catching up to him. It was the next morning that the first sign of the curse's power manifested once again. A fire broke out in the family's home, spreading quickly through the upper floors. The flames consumed the house in a matter of minutes, the heat so intense that nothing was left standing. When the fire department arrived, all that remained was the charred, smoking wreckage of the once grand townhouse. Elias stood in front of the ruins, staring at the destruction in silence. The flames had taken everything. His wealth, his power, his reputation, all gone in an instant. But worse than the loss of material things was the understanding that the curse had come for them once again. No matter how far they ran, no matter how hard they tried to escape, the curse had always been there, lurking in the background, waiting for the right moment to strike. The fire was the final straw. Elias could no longer deny the truth. The curse was real, and it was not finished with the Vandenbergs. The family was doomed, and there was no escaping it. The only question left was how much further it would go before it claimed them all. Elias's sense of dread only deepened after the fire. He had lost everything. The mansion, the life he had painstakingly built from the ruins of his past, was now nothing more than ashes and smoke. It was as if the curse had reached its final crescendo, wiping out everything in one swift, devastating blow. Yet, deep within him, Elias knew that the fire was not the end. It was merely a warning, a signal that the curse was far from finished with him and his family. The feeling of impending doom gnawed at his soul, and there was no escaping it. He had lived a life built on ambition, secrecy, and darkness, but now the price for those choices was becoming impossible to ignore. The fire had claimed their home, but it was the people who were left behind, the survivors, who would bear the true brunt of the curse. As if to mock the ruins of their past, Elias and his remaining family members moved into a modest apartment, far removed from the splendor they had once known. It was in this cramped, dimly lit space that they tried to rebuild what was left of their lives. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the curse was now tightening its grip on them, more insidious than ever before. Clara, Elias's daughter, had been away at boarding school when the fire struck. The girl had grown up with the dark whispers surrounding her family, but like many of the Vandenbergs before her, she had never fully understood the weight of the curse. Clara had always believed the tragedy was something in the past, something her ancestors had somehow brought upon themselves. The way her father had distanced himself from the world, the coldness that crept into his eyes, never quite made sense to her. It was only when she returned to New York to find the family's life shattered that she began to understand. Clara was a strong-willed, independent woman, determined to carve her own path. The Vandenberg legacy was something she had always tried to distance herself from, and with the fire, she now had no choice but to confront the past head-on. She had been informed of the tragedy through telegrams and frantic phone calls, but nothing could prepare her for the sight that awaited her. The apartment felt hollow, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The air was thick with a sense of loss and despair that Clara could feel deep in her bones. Upon her arrival, she found her father in a state of near total collapse. Elias had not been the same since the fire, his mind consumed with a sense of guilt and panic. He had been sleepwalking through his own life for weeks, haunted by visions of the past and riddled with the fear that the curse would claim him next. The man who had once ruled his family with a cold but calculating ambition now seemed like a shell of the person he had been. Clara's heart broke for him, but she couldn't allow herself to feel pity. There was something darker at work here, and she knew it. Over the following days, Clara's mind raced. She couldn't accept the notion that the fire had been a random event, a tragic accident. There had been too many signs, too many strange occurrences, too many unexplained deaths in their family's history. Something was causing this, and Clara needed to uncover the truth. For Elias's sake, for her own sanity, and for the future of whatever was left of the Vandenberg name, she had to find out what was behind the curse. Her search led her to a dusty, forgotten room in the back of the apartment. It was one of the few spaces that hadn't been fully unpacked after the move. Clara's curiosity pushed her toward the room, where she found a series of boxes filled with old journals, documents, and photographs. She had heard stories about her great-grandfather's journals, but she had never thought much of them. Now, however, they seemed to hold the key to understanding everything. Clara sifted through the pages, her heart pounding as she discovered references to the curse, references that were far darker and more detailed than anything she had imagined. There were accounts of sacrifices, of pacts made with entities no human should ever speak to, and of a hidden history tied to the pendant that had seemingly cursed their bloodline. Clara spent hours reading the journals, piecing together the fragmented accounts of her ancestors. It was clear now that the curse was not merely a superstition. It was a living, breathing entity, bound to their family for generations, feeding off their greed, ambition, and dark desires. The more she read, the more she understood. The curse had been passed down through the generations, each member of the Vandenberg family unknowingly feeding it, offering it pieces of themselves in exchange for power, wealth, and influence. But there was always a cost. The curse was relentless, and no matter how far they ran, it always found them. As the hours passed, Clara's resolve grew stronger. She knew what had to be done. She couldn't allow her family to fall further into this abyss. She had to break the cycle, but doing so would not be easy. The curse had been woven into the fabric of their family's history, its roots stretching deep into the past. There was no easy way to undo what had been done. But Clara believed there was a way, if she could only discover the final piece of the puzzle. But the more Clara uncovered, the more she began to question whether breaking the curse was even possible. Her father, Elias, had already lost everything. The curse had taken so much from him that there was little left to save. Yet there was one thing he still clung to, the pendant. It was a constant presence in his life, a symbol of his past, of his family's twisted legacy. Elias refused to part with it even when Clara begged him to let it go. The pendant was no longer just an object. It was a part of him, a reminder of everything he had done and everything he had lost. As Clara delved deeper into the curse's history, she began to realize that it was not simply a matter of stopping the cycle. The curse was something that had to be contained, something that had to be controlled. There was a ritual, one that required the participation of every living descendant of the Vandenberg family. It was a dangerous ritual, one that would demand great sacrifice, but it was the only way to ensure that the curse would not spread beyond them. With this realization came a new sense of urgency. Clara knew that she was running out of time. The curse had already claimed so much. If she didn't act quickly, it would take everything else, including her. But as she prepared to confront her father with the truth, she found herself doubting whether it was too late for him. Elias had become consumed by the curse, his mind fractured, his soul tethered to the pendant in a way that seemed beyond saving. The curse had already taken everything from their family, their wealth, their reputation, their peace of mind. And now it threatened to claim them all one by one until nothing remained. But Clara refused to let that happen. She would find a way to break the cycle, even if it meant making the ultimate sacrifice. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Clara knew that the ritual would not be easy, that it would demand everything of her. But it was the only way to end the nightmare that had haunted her family for so long. She couldn't let her father's madness consume her as well. She had to finish what her ancestors had started, even if it meant walking into the darkness alone. The night of the ritual, the air seemed charged with an electric energy, as though the curse itself was watching, waiting to see if they would succeed or fail. Clara stood before the altar, the pendant clutched tightly in her hand, knowing that the fate of the Vandenberg family rested on her shoulders. The ritual had to be performed exactly as described in the journals, no deviation, no hesitation. Every word had to be spoken, every movement had to be precise. As she began, Clara felt the weight of the centuries pressing down on her. The lives of her ancestors, their mistakes, their desires, and their greed, all seemed to converge in this one moment. But even as she spoke the words that had been passed down through generations, she felt a presence, an unseen force, watching her, waiting. The curse had not let go of the Vandenbergs, it never would. Clara's heart raced as she moved through the ritual, her mind focused on the task at hand. She knew that this was the only chance they had left. There was no going back. And as the final words left her lips, she felt the curse release its hold, felt the weight lifting from her shoulders. For a moment the air grew still, and then just as suddenly as it had come, the darkness seemed to vanish. But Clara knew that the curse was never truly gone. It would always remain a part of her family's legacy, a shadow lurking in the background. And as she looked at her father, still haunted by the weight of his past, she realized that the true battle was just beginning. The curse might have been broken, but its legacy would never die. It was something they would carry with them forever. The aftermath of the ritual left Clara in a state of both relief and trepidation. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had been hanging over the Vandenbergs for generations seemed to lift, but only for a moment. Despite her success in performing the ancient rites, Clara knew in her heart that the curse's true power lay not just in the pendant or the ritual itself, but in the Vandenbergs' bloodline. It was something far older, far more entrenched than she had initially realized. The curse was not just a supernatural force, it was a part of the family's identity, woven so deeply into their legacy that breaking it, even momentarily, was like severing a limb. She could feel the eyes of her ancestors upon her, their hopes and regrets pressing against her chest as if they were alive. Elias, who had been by her side throughout the ritual, remained eerily silent. The expression on his face was one of quiet resignation, as though he had long since accepted the inevitability of the curse's influence. His once sharp features now appeared hollow, aged beyond his years. Clara had seen glimpses of the man he had been before the curse overtook him. A man with potential, capable of kindness and warmth. But that man was long gone, replaced by the grim figure who had become obsessed with power and immortality at any cost. She had tried to reach him, to bring him back from the edge, but he was beyond saving. Or so she feared. The silence between them grew thick, oppressive, as they both sat in the dimly lit room, the remnants of the ritual still lingering in the air. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the Vandenbergs had never truly been free. Not from the curse. Not from the sins of their forefathers. She had hoped, with all her heart, that breaking the cycle would allow them to move forward, to rebuild their lives. But now, as she looked at her father, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The pendant, which she had hoped to destroy, was still around Elias's neck, its dark presence unchanged. "What have we done, father?" Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She had to ask, though she knew the answer would break her heart. "Is it really over?" Elias did not answer immediately. He stared into the distance, his eyes unfocused. It was as if the question itself had not yet fully reached him. Then finally he spoke, his voice hollow and distant. The curse has never been just about the pendant. It's about us, Clara. It's about what we've become. He paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. It's about the choices we make. Clara shivered. Those words, they felt like a warning. She had always believed that the curse could be undone with a single act of courage, a single moment of redemption. But Elias's words seemed to suggest that their fate had already been sealed. The curse had never been about external forces. It had been about the corruption within them all along. That was why it had never truly gone away despite their best efforts. It was their bloodline, their actions that kept it alive. Elias's gaze turned to her, and for the first time in years, Clara saw something like sorrow in his eyes. I tried, Clara. I tried to break free. But you can't outrun what's inside you. The curse, it feeds off of our weaknesses, our darkest desires. It was never just about what we wanted, it was about what we were willing to sacrifice to get it. Clara swallowed hard. Her father's words struck her with the force of 1,000 unspoken truths. She had spent so much of her life trying to escape the shadow of their family's history, but in that moment she realized that it wasn't the curse itself that had shaped them. It was the choices each generation had made. The choices to turn a blind eye to the cost of ambition, to believe that wealth, power, and success could erase their sins. What does this mean for us now? Clara asked, her voice trembling with the weight of what she had learned. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the pendant and held it in his palm, staring at it as though it were the key to understanding everything. It means we are bound to it, he said softly. We always have been. We cannot escape it. We can only live with it. Clara's heart sank. She had hoped so desperately that the ritual would break the cycle. But now it seemed they were trapped in a never-ending loop. The curse would not release its hold on them. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that perhaps the curse wasn't something to be destroyed. Perhaps it was something they had to learn to live with, to understand. Maybe the real power of the curse wasn't in its ability to take lives, but in its ability to force them to confront their own nature, their own deepest fears. As the days passed, Clara found herself questioning everything. She had been so certain, so sure that the curse could be undone with a single act of defiance. But now she began to understand that breaking the curse wasn't about defeating it, it was about accepting it. Accepting the darkness within them all, the flaws and the scars that defined the Vandenberg legacy. It was a painful realization, one that Clara had never imagined she would come to. But in the silence that had fallen between her and her father, she saw the truth. They were not free. They never would be. Elias, too, seemed to come to this conclusion, though he did not say it aloud. He was a broken man, consumed by his past, by the choices he had made. He had never asked for redemption. He had never believed it was possible. Instead, he had accepted the curse as part of who he was, part of what he had become. The fire, the losses, the betrayals, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle that he no longer wanted to solve. And so, they both sat in silence, knowing that their lives had been irrevocably changed. The curse had not been broken. It had merely been acknowledged. And now, Clara was left with the painful truth. No matter what they did, the Vandenbergs would never escape their fate. They were bound to it just as surely as they were bound to one another. They could not outrun their past, nor could they hide from it. The curse had shaped them, and it would continue to shape them until the end of their days. But Clara wasn't entirely defeated. Something inside her still burned with the desire for freedom, for a future where the Vandenbergs could live without the weight of their history pressing down on them. Perhaps it was naive, but Clara refused to let the curse define her. It had already taken so much from her family, but she would not let it take her will to fight. Elias, however, had already given up. He had made his peace with the curse, and he believed that it would eventually take everything from him. He was a man lost in his own regrets, his own mistakes. He had surrendered to the darkness and in doing so had become a part of it. Clara, however, knew that she still had a choice. And as the days passed and the seasons changed, she vowed to find a way to rise above the curse, to reclaim her family's honor and destiny. It would not be easy and she didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. The Vandenberg name was not destined to end in shadow. The curse had not broken her, but it had shown her something deeper, something she had never truly understood. The power to change, to break free from the chains of the past, could only come from within. It was not about escaping the curse. It was about accepting it, understanding it, and using its weight to shape a new future. And with that understanding, Clara began to see a path forward. One that would be filled with unimaginable challenges, but also with the possibility of redemption. The curse, she now realized, was not something they could outrun, but it was something they could confront head-on. The choice was hers, and in that moment Clara made the decision to face it no matter what the cost. The Vandenbergs may never be free from the curse, but they would fight for their place in the world, no matter the darkness that followed them. The weight of the decision Clara had made settled over her like a heavy cloak, the silence of the apartment amplifying the gravity of her resolve. The days that followed were marked by a quiet, almost painful anticipation. She had come to terms with the fact that the curse, though seemingly broken for the moment, was never going to relinquish its grip on the Vandenberg bloodline. The past hung over them like a cloud, dense and unyielding, yet she found herself unwilling to accept its complete dominion over their lives. There had to be a way to rise above it, to confront the darkness and, if not defeat it, at least tame it. Elias remained a shadow of the man he had once been. His days were spent in isolation, his thoughts consumed by the past, while Clara wrestled with the undeniable truth that her father would never recover from the weight of his own choices. She knew that as much as she longed to save him, she couldn't carry that burden alone. The Vandenbergs had always been a family defined by their ambition, their will to achieve greatness at any cost. But with that ambition came a darkness, an insatiable hunger that had ultimately consumed them. The curse had been born from that very hunger. It was the price they had paid for their success, their wealth, and their power. Despite her father's descent into madness, Clara could still see glimpses of the man he had been, the man who had once been filled with a fiery passion for life, a man who had sought to create a legacy that would outlast the very curse that bound them. That ambition was still there, buried deep beneath the layers of regret and despair. But it was a shadow of what it had once been. Clara understood now that her fight wasn't just to free her family from the curse. It was to restore the essence of what had once driven them forward. The family that had once been unstoppable, who had shaped entire communities with their wealth and influence, had become fractured, broken under the weight of their own sins. But how could she heal a family that had been fractured for so long? Clara's thoughts swirled in a whirlwind of unanswered questions, but she couldn't let herself be consumed by the enormity of it all. She had made the decision to confront the curse, and she would follow through with it, no matter the personal cost. There was no going back. She had to find a way to break the cycle of destruction that had plagued the Vandenbergs for generations. The first step was understanding the full extent of the curse's power. Clara knew that the pendant, though seemingly insignificant, was the key to everything. It had been passed down through the family for generations, each bearer of the cursed relic marked by the same insatiable drive for power. The pendant was not just a symbol, it was a tether, an anchor that tied the wearer to the curse. Without it, there would be no curse, no bloodline tainted by greed. Clara knew that destroying the pendant was the first step in freeing herself, her father, and their family from the past. But how could she destroy something so tied to their identity, something that had been passed down through the generations? Her father had warned her about this in subtle ways. Elias had always spoken of the power of the pendant, of how it had shaped their family, how it had influenced their decisions. He had never considered the idea of destroying it, of breaking the cycle. He had always seen it as something to be controlled, not eliminated. But Clara had seen the truth now. The pendant was not something to be controlled. It was a relic of their past, and it had to be buried with that past once and for all. In the days following the ritual, Clara spent every moment she could studying the pendant, examining its markings, its intricate design, and the history that was tied to it. She pored over old family records, searching for clues, trying to find a way to destroy what had plagued them for so long. Every piece of information she uncovered only deepened the mystery. The pendant was far older than she had ever imagined. It had been part of the Vandenberg legacy long before her great-grandfather had first laid eyes on it. It had been passed down through generations of men who had each been consumed by their own ambition, their own lust for power. The pendant was more than just an object. It was a conduit, a vessel for something far older and more powerful than any of them had realized. It had been created, it seemed, by an ancient order, a secret society whose very existence had been lost to history. The order had known of the power of the pendant and had used it to manipulate those who came into contact with it. The more Clara dug into the past, the more she realized that the curse was not just a family curse. It was a curse that had been passed down through countless generations, from one bloodline to another, as the pendant changed hands. The Vandenbergs had been the latest victims of this curse, but they were by no means the first. Clara was left with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: the pendant was not just a physical object. It was a link, a bridge between the past and the present. And it was this link that needed to be severed if her family was ever going to be free. The days turned into weeks, and the weight of Clara's decision pressed down on her with every passing moment. She had studied the pendant, studied the history, and now she had come to a final conclusion. The only way to destroy it, to sever the link to the curse, was to perform a ritual unlike anything her family had ever attempted. It would be dangerous. It would require great sacrifice. But if she was to free her family from the darkness that had plagued them for generations, it was the only option she had left. The ritual, according to the ancient texts she had uncovered, required not just the pendant, but the willing participation of every living Vandenberg descendant. It would be an act of total surrender, a final confrontation with the curse that had shaped their legacy. The ritual would require them to give up everything they held dear, their power, their wealth, their very identities. The curse had always thrived on their ambition, their hunger for more. To break the cycle, they would have to let go of that ambition, let go of the very thing that had driven them for generations. Clara knew this would not be easy. Her father, though broken and lost, would never willingly give up the pendant. It had been his anchor for so long, his only connection to the family legacy. To him, it was a symbol of everything they had fought for, everything they had built. But Clara had learned one thing above all: the curse was not their legacy. It was the thing that had destroyed it. And the only way to reclaim what was lost was to sever the connection between the pendant and their family once and for all. The ritual was set for the night of the new moon, when the veil between the worlds was thinnest. Clara prepared herself for the hardest decision of her life. She would have to confront the curse, face her family's legacy head-on, and ask them to give up everything they had ever known. It was a gamble, one that could cost them everything. But it was the only way to reclaim their future. The night arrived, and Clara stood alone in the dimly lit room, the pendant resting before her. She could feel the weight of it, its power pulsing like a heartbeat in the air. Her father, Elias, was seated in the corner, his face pale and drawn, as though he had already accepted the inevitability of what was to come. Clara could see the weariness in his eyes, the resignation that had taken root in his soul. She knew this was not a battle he could fight anymore. Clara took a deep breath and began the ritual. She recited the ancient words, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. As the words filled the air, she could feel the pendant growing heavier, as though the very fabric of time and space was shifting around them. The air grew thick with power, and Clara knew they were on the verge of something that would change their lives forever. The ritual demanded sacrifice, and Clara could feel the price of it. The pendant began to glow, its power surging, but Clara did not flinch. She could hear her father's labored breathing in the background, his gaze fixed on her. This was their last chance, to break free of the curse, to reclaim their future. The pendant would be destroyed, and with it, the chains that had bound them for so long would finally be broken.